It's commonly asserted that animal sacrifices are no longer necessary because of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Both were means to the same end, to account for sin. Furthermore, animal sacrifice was supposed to illustrate and foreshadow Jesus' sacrifice. There are some important distinctions, however, that show how Jesus did not actually meet the criterion for a sacrifice. Consider these 5 points. Unlike an animal, Jesus was a willing participant in his sacrifice. This isn't a terribly important point, but I think it's a detail worth mentioning. It is the person who chose the animal to part with, often a prized animal. Therefore, the sacrifice would be less meaningful if it were the animal who took the initiative in volunteering to be sacrificed, rather than the person being the one to make the difficult decision of choosing an animal. Which brings us to point 2. People killed animals they valued, which is what made the sacrifice meaningful. But the people who killed Jesus did not value him, which brings us to point 3. Animals were killed specifically because they were intended to be a sacrifice for the people who killed them. A person offered an animal to God and killed it. Not so with Jesus. The people who killed Jesus did not intend for him to be a sacrifice at all, and were unaware of his death being any kind of a sacrifice. Jesus was not an offering, in other words, by the people who killed him. God offered Jesus to himself, which is an illogical way for mankind to atone. If mankind knowingly offered Jesus, then at least that would be consistent with the concept of sacrifice. For example, if an ancient man's goat was unknowingly killed by a pack of wolves in the night, could the ancient man wake up the next morning to find his dead goat and legitimately say that he sacrificed his goat? No, of course not, as is the case with Jesus. But even if mankind knowingly offered Jesus, one could still argue that it's unfair to allow an innocent man to be held accountable for the guilty, even if such superstitious practices were consistent with the culture. Number 4, animal sacrifices weren't retroactive like Jesus' sacrifice. First came sin, then came the sacrifice. The opposite is so for everyone who has lived after Jesus' death. It would be shallow and insincere to kill an animal as an insurance policy just in case you sin in the future. Or to, for example, kill your goat on a Friday because you plan to have sex with your mistress on Saturday. This way, the sacrifice loses most of its meaning because you can sin with the assurance that a sacrifice has already been made on your behalf, like the so-called sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And 5, lastly, if an animal came back to life after it was killed, then it would be impossible to sacrifice it. One could argue that Jesus was never actually sacrificed at all. So consider this illustration. Imagine that you're living before the time of Christ. You are going to sin in the near future, so your goat, of its own volition, seeks out a den of wolves, and the wolves kill it, unbeknownst to you. Then the goat comes back to life and returns home. Would anybody in their right mind call that a sacrifice?